The wine glass slipped from Catherine Hale's manicured fingers, shattering against the marble floor of their Pacific Heights mansion. Blood pooled beneath the crystal shards, not from the glass, but from the lies that had finally cut too deep. In that moment, the empire of deception she had built around her tech millionaire husband Richard came crashing down, and the two people who brought it all to light were the last ones anyone would have suspected: a night shift waitress and a principled lawyer who refused to look the other way. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're serving tables, polishing glasses, or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will shake your heart. The fog rolled in thick over San Francisco Bay that October evening, wrapping around the glass towers of the financial district like a shroud. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, Richard Hale watched the city lights blur into watercolor streaks, his reflection ghosting over the view he'd worked 20 years to afford. At 45, he commanded a tech empire worth $800 million, built from a Stanford dorm room idea that revolutionized cloud storage. His stock portfolio alone generated more passive income in a month than most families saw in a lifetime, and his cryptocurrency investments, particularly his early Bitcoin acquisitions, had multiplied his wealth beyond even his ambitious projections. But money, Richard was learning, couldn't fill the hollow spaces in a marriage growing colder by the day. Catherine, his wife of 15 years, had become a stranger who shared his bed but not his dreams. She moved through their Nob Hill mansion like a beautiful ghost, her laughter reserved for charity galas and society photographers, never for the quiet moments when he needed it most. Their children, Emma and James, 16 and 14 respectively, had learned to navigate around their mother's moods like ships avoiding rocky shores. 3 miles away, in a cramped studio apartment above a Vietnamese PHO shop on Irving Street, Maria Santos folded her San Francisco State University textbooks into a backpack that had seen better years. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned early that respect was earned, not given. Her shifts at Café Lumière in Pacific Heights began at 11 p.m. and ended at 7 a.m., serving late-night espressos to venture capitalists, insomniacs, and the occasional tech executive who couldn't sleep with the weight of million-dollar decisions pressing on their consciousness. Maria's calloused hands told the story of her journey. Dishwasher at 15, server at 18, now studying business administration while supporting her younger sister's medical school tuition. She'd served coffee to senators and CEOs, invisible in her black uniform, listening to conversations that could move markets or destroy reputations. Her gift wasn't just remembering orders. It was reading people, seeing the truth they tried to hide behind expensive suits and practiced smiles. The late September evening when everything began to unravel started like any other. Catherine Hale swept into Café Lumière at 11:47 p.m., her Hermès heels clicking against the polished concrete floor. She chose the corner booth, the one with shadows deep enough to hide secrets, and ordered her usual double espresso, no sugar, with a splash of cream that cost more than Maria's hourly wage. Maria had served Catherine dozens of times over the past 6 months, watching her transformation from the poised socialite who graced magazine covers to a woman whose hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. Tonight, Catherine's phone conversation was hushed but urgent, her manicured nails drumming against the marble tabletop in a rhythm that spoke of anxiety. "The documents are ready," Catherine whispered into her phone, glancing around the nearly empty cafe. "Richard signed the addendum last week. He trusts me completely. The fool has no idea what's coming." Her laugh was sharp, brittle, like glass about to break. "Once the transfer goes through, I'll have access to the offshore accounts, $50 million in Bitcoin alone, plus the real estate portfolio. He'll never see it coming until it's too late." Maria's hands stilled on the espresso cup she was cleaning. The conversation wasn't meant for her ears, but in a cafe this small, with ceramic tiles that carried every whisper, Privacy was an illusion. Catherine's next words made Maria's blood run cold. George suspects something. The old fool has been Richard's housekeeper for 12 years. He knows too much. I'll handle him tomorrow. A few forged receipts, some missing cash from the household account, and Richard will believe his precious George has been stealing from us all along. The cup slipped from Maria's fingers, clattering against the counter. Catherine's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as they fixed on the waitress who'd suddenly become a witness to something dangerous. For a moment, their gazes held across the dimly lit cafe, predator and prey sizing each other up in the fluorescent twilight. "More coffee," Catherine said coldly, sliding her cup across the table. "And perhaps you could clean the tables in the back section. I'm sure you have better things to do than eavesdrop on private conversations." Maria's cheeks burned with the familiar shame of being dismissed, treated like furniture with legs. But beneath the humiliation, something harder was crystallizing, a determination she'd inherited from her grandmother, who'd raised 7 children while cleaning houses for families who never learned her name. This wasn't just about a rich woman's cruelty. It was about George, whoever he was, about to be destroyed by lies. Later that night, as Maria walked home through the fog-shrouded streets, Catherine's words echoed in her mind like a warning bell. She thought about the stories her business ethics professor had shared, corporate scandals that started with small betrayals, growing like cancer until they destroyed everything in their path. She thought about her own father, framed by a supervisor who needed a scapegoat, how his reputation never recovered even after the truth came out years later. By the time she reached her apartment, Maria had made a decision that would change 5 lives forever. She opened her laptop, created a new folder labeled Cafe Notes, and began typing everything she remembered from Catherine's conversation. Her fingers moved slowly but steadily across the keyboard, each word a small act of rebellion against the assumption that waitresses were deaf and blind to the secrets spilled around them. Meanwhile, across the city in a modest Castro District apartment, Daniel Hughes reviewed contracts by lamplight, his tired eyes scanning legal documents that would determine the financial futures of San Francisco's elite. At 34, Daniel had built his reputation on meticulous attention to detail and an unwavering moral compass that sometimes put him at odds with clients who preferred expedience over ethics. His phone buzzed with a message from Richard Hale's office. "Review estate planning addendum. Priority urgent. Substantial asset transfers involved." Daniel frowned at the timestamp. Who conducted major financial business at midnight? But Richard Hale's retainer paid his student loans and kept food on his table, so he opened the files and began his analysis. What he found made his coffee grow cold as he read. The addendum transferred significant portions of Richard's assets into accounts that Catherine controlled independently, including cryptocurrency holdings, real estate investments, and liquid assets worth nearly $150 million. The language was legally sound, but ethically questionable, a spouse gaining access to funds without the other party's full understanding of the implications. Daniel had seen this pattern before, in the divorce that destroyed his own family when he was 12. His mother had trusted his father completely, never questioning the papers she signed until she discovered that her name had been quietly removed from deeds and accounts. The betrayal had turned love into poison, leaving Daniel with a deep suspicion of relationships built on financial dependency. But suspicion wasn't evidence, and Daniel's job was to review legal documents, not psychoanalyze his clients' marriages. He approved the addendum with professional detachment, filing away his concerns as none of his business. It would take a waitress with sharp eyes and a conscience stronger than her fear to make him realize that sometimes being professionally detached meant becoming morally complicit. The next morning brought autumn's first real chill to San Francisco, the kind that cuts through expensive coats and cheap jackets with equal indifference. In the Hale Mansion's marble-floored kitchen, George Martinez moved with the careful precision of a man who'd spent 12 years anticipating his employer's needs. At 62, his salt and pepper hair was always perfectly combed, his uniform pressed to military standards, his manner respectful without being servile. George had served the Hale family since Emma was 4 and James was 2, watching them grow from toddlers into teenagers, celebrating their achievements, comforting them through childhood disappointments. He knew Richard's coffee preference changed with his stress levels, that Emma wrote poetry she thought no one read, that James missed his absent father more than he'd ever admit. The Hale mansion wasn't just his workplace. It was the closest thing to family he'd had since his wife died 5 years ago. Catherine descended the grand staircase at exactly 9 a.m., her silk robe flowing like water, her smile as sharp as cut crystal. "George," she said, her voice honey over steel, "I need to discuss some irregularities in the household accounts. Some money seems to have gone missing from the petty cash fund." George's weathered hands paused over the silver coffee service. "Missing money, Mrs. Hale? I've kept meticulous records of all household expenses. Perhaps there's been some confusion with the receipts." Catherine's eyes glittered with something that made George's chest tighten with unease. "Oh, there's no confusion, George. The receipts tell a very clear story. $5,000 in grocery expenses that never made it to our kitchen. Cash withdrawals from the household account that don't match your shopping reports. I've been very patient, hoping you'd come forward and explain, but my patience has limits." The words hit George like physical blows. In 12 years of faithful service, he'd never taken so much as a pen from the Hales' office, never accepted tips beyond Christmas bonuses, never gave them reason to question his integrity. "Mrs. Hale, I swear to you I've never stolen a single cent. There must be some mistake." "The mistake," Catherine interrupted, "was trusting you with access to the household accounts. I've already spoken to Richard about this. He's devastated, of course. You've been like family to us, but theft is theft regardless of our personal feelings." George felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Without this job, without a reference from the Hales, who would hire a 62-year-old housekeeper with a theft scandal shadowing his record? His modest savings wouldn't last 6 months, and his pride wouldn't survive returning to his hometown in Mexico as a failure and a thief. "Please," he whispered, his dignity cracking like old leather, "let me show you the real receipts. Let me prove—" "The evidence is quite clear," Catherine said, turning away as if the conversation bored her. "You have until this evening to gather your things. Richard will pay you through the end of the month. He's generous that way, even to those who've betrayed his trust." As Catherine glided back upstairs, George sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his hands shaking as he tried to process what had just happened. In the space of 5 minutes, his life had been dismantled by accusations he couldn't fight, evidence he couldn't explain, and a woman whose smile had always made him uneasy, but whose hostility he'd never imagined could be so precisely cruel. That afternoon, Emma Hale found George packing his belongings in the small room above the garage that had been his home for over a decade. The teenager's eyes were red with tears. She was too proud to let fall in front of her parents. "This is wrong," she whispered fiercely. "You would never steal from us. I know you wouldn't." George's heart broke a little more at the faith in her voice. "Sometimes, Mija, what we know in our hearts and what the world believes are two different things. Your family has been good to me. I won't make this harder for them by fighting accusations I can't prove wrong." But Emma had inherited her father's stubborn streak and her own sense of justice. That night, she began her own quiet investigation, going through household receipts, checking dates and amounts, looking for the truth that adults seemed determined to ignore. What she found would eventually help bring down the web of lies her mother had spun. But for now, it was just a 16-year-old girl's refusal to let injustice stand unopposed. Maria Santos watched the evening news from her small apartment, seeing a familiar face in a brief financial segment about tech industry mergers. Richard Hale stood at a podium, announcing his company's acquisition of a cybersecurity firm, his smile confident, but his eyes hollow with some unspoken exhaustion. The reporter mentioned his supportive wife, Catherine, and their philanthropic work in the community, painting a picture of domestic bliss that Maria now knew was as false as a counterfeit bill. She thought about George, whoever he was, probably packing his life into boxes while Catherine Hale celebrated her successful deception. The thought made Maria's stomach churn with a familiar cocktail of anger and helplessness, the same feeling she'd carried since childhood, watching her mother work 16-hour days for families who treated her like an appliance that occasionally needed oil changes. Maria had learned early that the world was divided into those who spoke and those who listened, those who accused and those who bore the weight of accusations, those who shaped narratives and those who lived within the stories others told about them. But sometimes, just sometimes, the listeners and the burden bearers and the background characters found ways to rewrite the stories that were supposed to define them. She opened her laptop and added more notes to her growing file, details from news reports, observations from Catherine's cafe visits, fragments of overheard conversations that painted a picture of deception more complex than she'd initially realized. Maria wasn't sure what she planned to do with this information, but her grandmother had always said that truth was like water. It found ways to surface, even through the smallest cracks. As fog rolled in from the Pacific, wrapping the city in silver silence, 5 lives moved toward a collision that would expose the beautiful lies of Pacific Heights and reveal the uncomfortable truths hiding beneath them. In their separate corners of San Francisco, a millionaire slept uneasily beside a stranger wearing his wife's face. A waitress studied for finals while documenting evidence of betrayal. A lawyer reviewed contracts that felt increasingly wrong. A disgraced housekeeper packed memories of a family that no longer wanted him. And a teenage girl searched for proof that would vindicate the innocent and condemn the guilty. The next evening brought Catherine back to Café Lumière, but this time she wasn't alone. The man across from her was thin and nervous, his expensive suit unable to hide the anxiety radiating from his every gesture. Maria recognized him from newspaper photos. Marcus Webb, Richard's business partner and closest friend, the co-founder who'd helped build their company from a dorm room dream into a Silicon Valley empire. "The timing has to be perfect," Catherine murmured, leaning across the small table. "Richard's presenting at the tech conference in Austin next week. 3 days away from home, away from the lawyers, away from anyone who might ask inconvenient questions. That's when we execute the final transfers." Marcus Webb's coffee sat untouched, growing cold as his moral compass spun wildly between greed and loyalty. "Catherine, this is Richard we're talking about. He's been my best friend since college. We built this company together, shared every success, every failure. How can you not?" Catherine's interruption was silk wrapped around steel. "We've been planning this for months. The offshore accounts are ready, the cryptocurrency transfers are programmed, the documentation is airtight. You'll walk away with $20 million and a new life in the Cayman Islands. Richard will never even know you were involved. He'll blame hackers, disgruntled employees, anyone but his beloved business partner." Maria's hands trembled as she wiped down tables nearby, each word falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would eventually become tsunamis. Marcus Webb wasn't just another conspirator. He was Richard's best friend, the best man at his wedding, godfather to his children. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was personal devastation designed to destroy Richard's faith in everyone he'd ever trusted. "And if something goes wrong," Marcus asked, his voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient jazz. "If Richard discovers the truth?" Catherine's smile was predatory in the dim lighting. "Nothing will go wrong. George is already gone, fired for theft, his reputation destroyed, his credibility worthless if he tries to speak against me." Daniel Hughes reviewed and approved the estate addendum. "Legally, I have every right to access those assets." Richard's own lawyer sanctioned the transfers. Who's going to believe that his loving wife and trusted business partner conspired against him? Maria felt something snap inside her chest, not breaking, but crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous than her usual quiet acceptance. This wasn't just about money or marriage or corporate betrayal. This was about the systematic destruction of good people who'd spent their lives believing that loyalty mattered, that trust meant something, that service and friendship and professional integrity would be rewarded rather than exploited. She thought about her father, broken by false accusations. She thought about George, wherever he was, carrying shame that belonged to someone else. She thought about Richard Hale sleeping peacefully beside the woman who was methodically dismantling his life. Most of all, she thought about Daniel Hughes, the lawyer whose approval was being weaponized against an innocent man who probably had no idea his professional competence was enabling a crime. As Catherine and Marcus left the cafe, their conspiracy complete and their victim still unaware of the noose tightening around his throat, Maria made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she'd developed during years of invisible service. She was going to find Daniel Hughes, and she was going to make sure he understood exactly what his legal expertise was being used to accomplish. The next morning, Maria stood outside the glass tower that housed Hughes and Associates, wearing her best dress, the navy blue one she'd bought for her sister's graduation, and carrying a manila folder that contained 6 months of carefully documented evidence. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she rode the elevator to the 15th floor, knowing that she was about to step out of her assigned role as invisible service worker and into the dangerous territory of someone who refused to mind her own business. Daniel Hughes looked exactly like his law firm's website photo. Earnest brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, prematurely gray hair at 34, the kind of face that suggested he'd rather be reading contracts than attending cocktail parties. His office was modest by San Francisco standards, furnished with practical furniture and legal texts, rather than the marble and mahogany that proclaimed wealth and status. "Ms. Santos," he said, rising from behind his desk with the careful politeness of someone who wasn't sure why a waitress wanted to meet with him. "Your message mentioned Richard Hale's estate planning. I'm afraid I can't discuss client confidentialities without proper authorization." "Mr. Hughes," Maria interrupted, her voice steadier than she'd expected, "I'm not here for legal advice. I'm here because your client's wife is planning to rob him blind, and your legal work is the key to her entire scheme." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Daniel's professional expression flickered, revealing something sharper underneath: intelligence, integrity, and the kind of moral courage that had made him question the midnight addendum even when questioning wasn't profitable. Maria opened her folder and began to speak, laying out everything she'd witnessed and documented, watching Daniel's expression shift from skeptical politeness to growing horror as the scope of Catherine's deception became clear. She told him about the cafe conversations, the conspiracy with Marcus Webb, the destruction of George's reputation, the upcoming transfers scheduled for Richard's absence. "This is impossible," Daniel whispered, but his voice carried the weight of someone who knew, deep in his bones, that impossible things happened every day in the intersection between money and human weakness. The estate addendum was legally sound. Catherine has power of attorney for certain decisions. Even if what you're saying is true, she has legal authority to make these transfers. "Legal authority gained through deception," Maria said quietly. "Richard signed those papers because he trusted his wife, not because he understood he was essentially signing his financial death warrant. You reviewed the documents. Did anyone explain to Richard what he was really agreeing to?" Daniel's silence was answer enough. The addendum had been presented as routine estate planning, tax optimization, the kind of financial housekeeping that wealthy couples handled through their lawyers. Richard had signed it the way people sign mortgage papers, trusting that the professionals involved were protecting his interests rather than enabling his betrayal. For the next hour, Maria and Daniel sat in his office as autumn sunlight shifted across the floor. Two people from different worlds, united by the uncomfortable realization that they were the only ones standing between a good man and the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. Daniel's legal training told him to report the conversation to Richard directly, to document everything and let the chips fall where they might. But his experience with family betrayal whispered warnings about the ways truth could be twisted, evidence dismissed, messengers blamed for the messages they carried. "We need more than conversations overheard in a cafe," Daniel said finally. "Catherine is smart, connected, legally sophisticated. She's constructed this deception carefully. My involvement gives her cover. Marcus Webb's participation provides access. George's disgrace eliminates a potential witness. Even if we warn Richard, she can claim we're conspiring against her, that a disgruntled waitress and an ambitious lawyer are trying to manipulate him against his wife." Maria nodded, understanding the chess game they were trapped within. Catherine held most of the pieces: social position, legal authority, a 15-year marriage, the presumption of innocence that came with designer clothes and charity galas. Maria owned a waitress uniform and a file folder of accusations that could easily be dismissed as service worker resentment against the wealthy. But Maria had learned something in her years of invisible service: watching powerful people when they thought no one was looking. The more elaborate the deception, the more vulnerable it became to simple truth. Catherine's plan depended on complexity: legal documents, financial transfers, technological systems, the assumption that no one would look too closely at the details. But lies, no matter how sophisticated, left traces that curious minds could follow. "There's something else," Maria said, pulling out her phone. Catherine mentioned something about offshore accounts and cryptocurrency transfers. She seemed very confident about the technical aspects, more confident than someone should be unless they have had help from someone who really understands these systems. Daniel frowned, his legal mind immediately grasping the implications. Richard's company specializes in cybersecurity. If Catherine has inside knowledge about cryptocurrency transfers and offshore banking, she's had help from someone with technical expertise. Someone who understands Richard's business well enough to know how to steal from him without triggering security protocols. The realization hit them simultaneously. Marcus Webb wasn't just Catherine's co-conspirator in betraying Richard personally. As co-founder of the company, he had access to technical resources, security systems, financial protocols that would make sophisticated theft not just possible, but nearly undetectable. Catherine's deception wasn't just a matter of forged documents and manipulated trust. It was corporate espionage conducted by the very people Richard trusted most completely. As Maria left Daniel's office that afternoon, with plans to meet again once he'd conducted his own investigation into the estate documents, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She was no longer just a waitress who'd overheard something suspicious. She was a witness to a crime in progress, an ally in a battle against betrayal, a guardian of truth in a world that often preferred comfortable lies to inconvenient honesty. Walking home through the Castro district's rainbow-painted crosswalks, Maria thought about her grandmother's stories of the maquiladora where she'd worked, the factory where women sewed clothes for American companies, invisible hands creating visible products, their labor essential but their identities erased. Her grandmother had always said that invisible people saw everything, heard everything, knew everything. The powerful thought was secret. The challenge was finding ways to make the invisible visible, to give voice to the voiceless, to transform observation into action. That night, Emma Hale discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in her mother's home office, behind books that were clearly never read, she found a box of documents that told a story very different from the one Catherine had constructed for public consumption. Bank statements showing transfers to accounts Emma didn't recognize. Correspondence with lawyers her father had never mentioned. Most damning of all, receipts and invoices that proved George's innocence beyond any doubt. Evidence that Catherine had manufactured the theft charges to remove him from the household before her final betrayal. Emma sat on her mother's Persian rug, surrounded by proof of deceptions she'd suspected but hoped weren't true, tears falling onto papers that represented the death of every comfortable assumption about her family. Her mother wasn't just unfaithful. She was a predator who'd systematically destroyed innocent people to achieve her goals. George wasn't a thief. He was a victim whose reputation had been sacrificed to protect Catherine's larger scheme. But Emma was her father's daughter, with his stubborn insistence on justice and her own fierce loyalty to people who'd shown her kindness. George had taught her to make tamales for Dia de los Muertos, had bandaged scraped knees and celebrated good report cards, had been more of a father figure during Richard's long work hours than her own father had sometimes managed to be. The thought of him somewhere in the city, carrying shame that belonged to Catherine, made Emma's grief transform into something harder and more dangerous: determination. She photographed every document with her phone, uploaded the images to a cloud storage account Catherine couldn't access, and began planning her own quiet investigation. If adults were going to behave like children, then maybe it was time for the children to behave like adults. The tech conference in Austin was scheduled to begin on a Thursday morning, with Richard delivering the keynote address on Friday afternoon. Catherine's plan was elegant in its simplicity: execute the major financial transfers while Richard was on stage in front of 3,000 industry professionals, his attention completely focused on business rather than personal finances. By the time he returned to San Francisco, $50 million in cryptocurrency and another $100 million in traditional assets would be safely moved to accounts she controlled independently. Marcus Webb had already booked his flight to Grand Cayman, a briefcase full of untraceable documents and a new identity waiting for him at a bank that specialized in helping wealthy people disappear. Catherine had reservations at a spa in Switzerland, the kind of place where women went to recover from difficult divorces and emerged with new faces and new names. But their carefully orchestrated betrayal had a flaw they couldn't have anticipated. They'd underestimated the moral courage of people they considered beneath their notice: a waitress who refused to let injustice pass unremarked, a lawyer who chose integrity over expedience, a teenager who loved the man being framed more than the mother orchestrating his destruction. On Wednesday evening, as Richard packed for his flight to Austin, Daniel Hughes requested an emergency meeting at Café Lumière, neutral ground where Maria could join them without raising Catherine's suspicions. The three of them sat in the same corner booth where Catherine had planned her betrayal, as Daniel laid out everything he'd discovered in his investigation of the estate documents. Richard listened in stunned silence as the scope of his wife's deception became clear: the manipulated signatures, the unauthorized account access, the systematic theft disguised as legal financial planning. When Daniel showed him the evidence of George's innocence, carefully documented and impossible to dismiss, Richard's composure finally cracked. 15 years, he whispered, staring at bank statements that read like a roadmap of betrayal. 15 years of marriage, of partnership, of thinking I knew the woman sharing my bed. How does someone hide this level of deception for so long? Maria, who'd spent her life watching people when they thought no one was looking, chose her words carefully. She didn't hide it, Mr. Hale. She just counted on nobody caring enough to look closely. Rich people, poor people, we all see what we want to see, believe what's comfortable to believe. Your wife understood that, and she used it against everyone who trusted her. The plan they developed that evening was simple but precise. Richard would attend the conference as scheduled, but his phone would remain connected to Daniel's monitoring software, alerting them the moment any unauthorized transfers were attempted. Emma would continue documenting her mother's activities, providing real-time intelligence about Catherine's movements. Maria would maintain her normal routine at the cafe, ready to witness and record any conversations between Catherine and Marcus as their plan moved toward execution. Most importantly, they would give Catherine enough rope to hang herself, allowing her to believe her deception was succeeding while actually documenting every illegal action she took. By the time she realized her beautiful lies had been exposed, the evidence of her betrayal would be overwhelming and undeniable. Friday afternoon in Austin, Richard stood at the podium of the convention center's main hall, delivering his keynote address to an audience of tech executives and venture capitalists who saw him as one of Silicon Valley's great success stories. His presentation on the future of cybersecurity was polished and confident, but beneath his professional demeanor, his phone buzzed with alerts that told a very different story. At 2:47 p.m. Pacific Time, while Richard discussed enterprise-level encryption protocols, Catherine initiated the first major transfer. $15 million in Bitcoin moved from Richard's primary cryptocurrency wallet to an account registered in the Cayman Islands. At 3:15 p.m., while Richard fielded questions about artificial intelligence in security applications, another $20 million vanished from investment accounts in Switzerland and Singapore. Back in San Francisco, Daniel Hughes watched the theft unfold in real time from his office computer, each transaction automatically documented and recorded. Maria Santos served coffee to Catherine and Marcus Webb at Café Lumière, listening to their satisfied conversation about flights booked and new identities prepared. Emma Hale sat in her mother's office, photographing documents that Catherine thought were safely hidden, building an archive of evidence that would eventually convict the very people who'd thought themselves above consequences. By 4:30 p.m., when Richard's presentation concluded to thunderous applause, $93 million had been stolen from accounts he'd spent 20 years building. Catherine's deception was complete, technically, legally, and apparently successfully. As Richard accepted congratulations from colleagues who admired his business acumen, his wife was already in a taxi to San Francisco International Airport, a woman who'd transformed 15 years of marriage into the most profitable business venture of her life. But Catherine had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that Richard's discovery of the theft would lead to private confrontation, lawyers and mediators, the kind of discreet divorce proceedings that wealthy couples use to divide assets and preserve reputations. She'd never imagined that her systematic destruction of innocent people would inspire them to seek not just justice, but public vindication. Richard's flight from Austin landed at SFO at 11:30 p.m., where Daniel Hughes waited with a briefcase full of evidence and a story that revealed Catherine's betrayal in all its calculated cruelty. They drove through the fog-shrouded streets of San Francisco in silence, two men who'd learned that trust was a luxury that could be systematically exploited by people skilled in deception. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't the screaming match or tearful reconciliation that movies had taught them to expect. Richard found Catherine in their bedroom, calmly packing jewelry into a travel case, her movements efficient and unemotional. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, the mask of loving wife slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Richard," she said, her voice steady, "you're home early. How was the conference?" "Profitable," Richard replied, setting Daniel's briefcase on the bed between them. "Apparently not as profitable as your activities while I was away, but educational nonetheless." Catherine's hands paused over her jewelry, her sharp mind immediately calculating the implications of Richard's tone, Daniel's presence in their home, the briefcase full of documents. "I'm not sure what you mean. I've been here all evening, resting. I think I might be coming down with something. Stress, probably. Marriage can be so taxing when one partner travels constantly." Richard opened the briefcase and began laying out bank statements, transfer records, documented conversations, photograph evidence, a paper trail of betrayal so comprehensive that denial became impossible. Catherine watched her carefully constructed deception laid bare with the same detached interest she might show for a particularly well-executed chess game. $93 million, Richard said quietly. 15 years of marriage, 20 years of building a business, 12 years of trusting George with our family, and you turned all of it into a commodity to be stolen and sold. The money I can recover, most of it anyway. The trust you've destroyed, the lives you've damaged, the relationships you've poisoned, those are losses that can't be calculated in any currency. Catherine's response surprised them both with its complete lack of remorse or justification. "You were never going to leave me anything meaningful in your will, Richard. Your children, your company, your precious philanthropic foundations. I would have been left with a comfortable allowance and a lifetime of playing grateful widow to your legacy. This way, I get what I deserve for 15 years of playing the perfect wife to a man who loved his computers more than his family." The honesty was brutal and somehow cleaner than any lie she could have told. Catherine hadn't fallen into temptation or been corrupted by bad influences. She'd simply decided that their marriage was a business arrangement that wasn't providing adequate returns on her investment, and she'd taken steps to improve her position through what she considered entrepreneurial initiative. "What about George?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. "What did an innocent man deserve for 12 years of faithful service to your family?" Catherine shrugged, a gesture that dismissed George's suffering as easily as she might wave away a persistent waiter. George was collateral damage. His reputation was a small price to pay for ensuring he couldn't interfere with my plans. Besides, he'll recover. Honest people always do, don't they? They're so resilient in their martyrdom. It was Emma who provided the final twist, appearing in the bedroom doorway with her own briefcase full of documented evidence. "Not just George, Mom. You destroyed Marcus Webb's life too, didn't you? I heard you on the phone with him last month, telling him about the gambling debts you'd secretly arranged for him, the financial pressure that made him desperate enough to become your accomplice." Catherine's mask slipped entirely then, revealing not just coldness, but genuine surprise at being outmaneuvered by her 16-year-old daughter. Emma had inherited Richard's analytical mind and her own mother's talent for seeing through deceptions, a combination that made her particularly dangerous to someone whose life was built on carefully maintained illusions. "Marcus Webb is trapped in Grand Cayman right now," Emma continued, "waiting for money transfers that will never come because the FBI is already tracking the accounts you set up in his name. You never intended to share the stolen money with him. He was just another patsy to take the blame if your plan failed." The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough, aided by the meticulous documentation that Maria, Daniel, and Emma had provided. Catherine's deception unraveled under professional scrutiny, revealing layers of fraud and manipulation that extended far beyond simple marital betrayal. Marcus Webb, confronted with evidence of his unwitting participation in Catherine's larger scheme, cooperated fully with authorities in exchange for reduced charges and protection from the gambling debts Catherine had arranged to manipulate him. George Martinez was not only cleared of all accusations, but offered a substantial settlement for the damage to his reputation, along with a written apology from Richard that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle's business section. His integrity vindicated and his finances secured, George chose to retire to a small house in San Rafael, where he grew tomatoes and taught cooking classes to young people who reminded him of the Hale children during happier times. Maria Santos found herself in an unexpected position, a working-class waitress who'd become a key witness in one of San Francisco's most publicized white-collar crime cases. The media attention was uncomfortable but temporary. More lasting was the scholarship Richard established in her name, providing tuition assistance for students who worked service jobs while pursuing business degrees. She graduated summa cum laude and eventually opened her own consulting firm, specializing in corporate ethics training for businesses that wanted to prevent the kind of systematic betrayal that had nearly destroyed the Hale family. Daniel Hughes discovered that his integrity, rather than costing him clients, had enhanced his reputation throughout San Francisco's legal community. Richard retained him as general counsel for his restructured company, and Daniel's firm became known for the careful ethical review that prevented well-intentioned business people from unknowingly enabling fraudulent schemes. 6 months after Catherine's arrest, Richard stood in the renovated kitchen of his Pacific Heights mansion, watching Emma teach James how to make George's famous tamales, while Maria Santos and her sister Sophia laughed at their clumsy corn husk wrapping technique. The house felt different now, warmer, more honest, filled with relationships based on choice rather than obligation or financial dependence. "You know what the strangest part is?" Richard said to Maria as they watched the teenagers struggle with the traditional recipe George had written out for them. I'm worth about $200 million less than I was a year ago, between what Catherine stole and the legal settlements. But I feel richer than I've ever felt in my life. Maria smiled, understanding completely. She'd learned long ago that the most valuable things, respect, integrity, meaningful relationships, couldn't be quantified in financial statements or stolen through sophisticated deceptions. Money just amplifies what's already inside people, Mr. Hale. If you're generous and honest, money makes those qualities more powerful. If you're selfish and dishonest, money just makes you more efficiently harmful. As autumn deepened into winter, the cafe where everything began became a regular meeting place for an unlikely group of friends: a tech millionaire learning to live without marriage, a lawyer who'd chosen ethics over expedience, a waitress studying business administration, a teenager who'd saved her father by refusing to ignore her mother's cruelty. They met for coffee and conversation, sharing stories and supporting each other through the complex process of rebuilding trust after systematic betrayal. Emma kept the letter she'd written to Maria during the darkest days of the investigation, when everyone was afraid the truth wouldn't be enough to overcome Catherine's carefully constructed lies. In it, she'd written, "Thank you for seeing us when we couldn't see ourselves. Thank you for caring about people you barely knew. Thank you for being brave when being brave was dangerous." The letter remained pinned to Maria's bulletin board long after she'd graduated, started her career, and moved into her own apartment with windows overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. It served as a daily reminder that heroism wasn't always dramatic or well compensated. Sometimes it was just the quiet decision to refuse complicity with injustice, to speak truth when silence would be safer, to care about strangers' suffering when indifference would be easier. Catherine Hale was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy charges. She served her time quietly, maintaining her innocence and dignity even after conviction. A woman who'd gambled everything on her ability to manipulate trust and lost to people she'd considered beneath her notice. Prison, she discovered, was remarkably democratic. Money couldn't buy respect from women who'd been betrayed by people they'd trusted. And social position meant nothing to guards and fellow inmates who judged character by actions rather than bank account balances. Marcus Webb served 18 months in minimum security prison before being released to supervised probation and community service. He returned to San Francisco a changed man, working as a counselor for gambling addiction and speaking to business groups about the dangerous intersection between financial stress and ethical compromise. His friendship with Richard never recovered. Trust, once broken by betrayal, couldn't be rebuilt through apologies or good intentions, but they achieved a kind of professional respect based on shared understanding of human weakness and the importance of second chances. On a foggy evening 2 years after Catherine's conviction, Maria Santos stood behind the counter of her own cafe, a small place in the Mission District that served excellent coffee to students, artists, and working people who appreciated quality without pretension. The walls were decorated with photographs of customers celebrating graduations, promotions, small victories achieved through hard work and perseverance. Her business model was simple: treat everyone with dignity, pay living wages, create a space where people felt seen and valued regardless of their social position or economic status. Richard Hale stopped by regularly, always ordering the same double espresso that had started their unlikely friendship. Sometimes Emma and James joined him, teenagers who'd learned early that character mattered more than comfort, that loyalty was earned rather than assumed, that love without honesty was just prettily decorated selfishness. "Any regrets?" Richard asked Maria one evening as she wiped down tables and prepared to close. Maria considered the question seriously, thinking about all the ways her life had changed since she'd made the decision to refuse silence in the face of injustice. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd minded my own business that night at Café Lumière." Would Catherine have succeeded? Would George still be carrying shame that belonged to someone else? Would you still be married to a stranger? And, Richard prompted, and then I remember that there's no such thing as other people's business when it comes to cruelty and betrayal. We're all connected. Your pain becomes my pain. My silence becomes your isolation. Catherine understood that, which is why her deception worked as long as it did. She counted on good people choosing comfort over courage, privacy over responsibility. Richard nodded, understanding that Maria had given him something more valuable than just evidence of his wife's betrayal. She'd shown him that integrity wasn't a luxury that only wealthy people could afford. It was a choice that anyone could make, regardless of their circumstances or the personal cost of doing right. As Maria locked the cafe door and walked home through streets that held memories of fear and triumph, she thought about all the invisible people doing essential work: waitresses and housekeepers, lawyers and teachers, teenagers and immigrants, whose quiet courage held society together when selfishness threatened to tear it apart. Her grandmother had been right. Invisible people saw everything, heard everything, knew everything. The challenge was finding the courage to make the invisible visible, to transform observation into action, to choose justice over safety when the two couldn't coexist. 3 years later, on a bright spring morning that painted San Francisco's hills in shades of gold and green, Maria received an unexpected visitor at her cafe. George Martinez, now 75 but still carrying himself with dignity, entered quietly and approached the counter with the respectful manner that had made him beloved by the Hale children. "Ms. Santos," he said, removing his hat with old-world courtesy, "I wanted to thank you properly, not just for clearing my name, but for showing me that there are still people in this world who believe that truth matters more than convenience." Maria felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this man whose life Catherine had tried to destroy, who had endured months of shame and exile before justice prevailed. "George, you don't need to thank me. You were the victim. I was just someone who refused to let injustice stand." "You were much more than that," George replied, accepting the cup of coffee she poured for him. "You were proof that goodness exists in unexpected places, that courage doesn't require money or status, just a heart that refuses to accept cruelty as normal." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people whose lives had been forever changed by their encounter with betrayal and their choice to stand against it. George told her about his cooking classes, the young immigrants he mentored, the community garden he'd started in his modest San Rafael neighborhood. Maria shared stories of her consulting business, the corporations she'd helped develop ethical guidelines, the whistleblowers she'd supported through the terrifying process of speaking truth to power. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't been working that night," George mused, stirring cream into his coffee. "If you had been sick, or if someone else had been serving Catherine's table." Maria had wondered the same thing countless times. "I think someone else would have stepped forward eventually. Maybe not that night, maybe not in time to save you from immediate harm, but truth has a way of surfacing." The problem wasn't that no one knew Catherine was capable of deception. The problem was that people who suspected something chose convenience over conscience. As George prepared to leave, he pulled a small wrapped package from his pocket. "This belonged to my wife," he said quietly. "She always said that angels come in many forms, often wearing work uniforms instead of wings. I think she would want you to have this." Inside the tissue paper was a simple gold locket, worn smooth by years of loving touch. Maria opened it to find 2 small photographs, George and his wife on their wedding day, young and hopeful, their eyes bright with dreams of the future they would build together through decades of hard work and mutual support. "George, I can't accept this," Maria whispered, but he was already shaking his head. "Mariella would have liked you very much," he said, using his wife's name with the tenderness that 25 years of marriage had never diminished. "She always said that the most beautiful jewelry was meaningless unless it was worn by someone who understood its value. You understand what it means to protect people's dreams, their dignity, their right to be judged by their character rather than other people's lies. After George left, Maria wore the locket as she continued her morning routine, feeling the weight of his wife's memory and trust. It reminded her of all the sacrifices that had made her own success possible. Her grandmother's 17-hour days in the maquiladora, her mother's quiet dignity through years of social invisibility, her sister Sophia's determination to become a doctor, despite every systemic barrier designed to prevent girls like them from achieving professional success. Late that afternoon, as the cafe filled with its usual mix of students and artists, Maria noticed a young woman sitting alone in the corner booth where Catherine had once planned her betrayal. The woman's clothes were clean but inexpensive, her textbooks spread across the small table, her expression carrying the familiar weight of someone working multiple jobs while pursuing dreams that felt simultaneously urgent and impossible. Maria approached with a fresh cup of coffee and a gentle smile. Studying for finals. The young woman looked up with tired but grateful eyes. "Business administration," she said. "I'm trying to finish my degree before my savings run out. It's harder than I expected, balancing work and school, especially when your employers don't always understand that education is important too." "What kind of work?" Maria asked, settling into the opposite seat with the easy manner of someone who had made this cafe a place where conversations mattered more than transactions. "I clean offices downtown," the woman replied without shame, though Maria heard the steel in her voice that came from defending her dignity against people who treated service work as evidence of personal failure. "It's honest work, and it pays better than retail, but the hours are difficult. I work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., then go straight to classes. By the time I get home, I have maybe 3 hours to study before I have to sleep and start over." Maria felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the recognition of her own former self in this young woman's story. "What's your name?" "Carmen Rodriguez. I'm probably the only student in my program who's never been inside a corporate boardroom, but I know how those buildings work after hours. I know which executives stay late, which companies have ethical problems, which deals get discussed when people think only the cleaning staff is listening." The echo of her own experience made Maria lean forward with new interest. "What do you mean by ethical problems?" Carmen glanced around the cafe, ensuring they weren't overheard, then spoke in the careful voice of someone who had learned that invisible people saw everything but were expected to remain silent. "There's this investment firm, Pacific Capital Management. I clean their offices every Tuesday and Friday night. For the past 6 months, I've been hearing conversations about client money being moved without proper authorization. They think I don't speak English well enough to understand, but my English is better than their Spanish." Maria's consulting experience immediately recognized the pattern Carmen was describing. Moving client money without authorization is securities fraud. "Are you sure about what you've heard?" "I'm sure about what I've witnessed," Carmen said carefully. "Documents left on desks, computer screens left open, phone conversations where they discuss which clients are too elderly or too trusting to notice irregular statements. They've been systematically stealing from retirees who trusted them with their life savings." The weight of another potential Catherine Hale situation settled over Maria like a familiar burden. Here was another young woman in service work, witnessing corporate betrayal, faced with the choice between personal safety and public responsibility. The parallels were so exact that Maria briefly wondered if the universe had a sense of justice that operated through coincidence. "Carmen," Maria said carefully, "what you're describing could destroy the financial security of dozens or hundreds of innocent people. But speaking up could also put you at serious risk. Lost job, immigration problems if they try to retaliate, legal costs you can't afford." Carmen's response was immediate and resolute. "My grandmother saved every penny for 40 years to have enough money for her retirement. She trusted a financial advisor who promised to help her money grow safely. 6 months ago, she discovered that most of her savings had disappeared into management fees and administrative costs she'd never authorized. She's too proud to ask for help, but I know she's eating 1 meal a day so she can afford her medications." Maria understood completely. Carmen wasn't just witnessing abstract corporate crime. She was seeing her grandmother's suffering multiplied across every elderly client who trusted Pacific Capital Management with their financial security. The personal had become political. The professional had become deeply personal. If you decide to report this, and I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, you'll need more than overheard conversations, Maria said, shifting into the consulting mode that had made her successful. You'll need documentation, evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. And you'll need legal representation that specializes in securities fraud and whistleblower protection. Carmen nodded, her expression showing the same determined courage that Maria recognized from her own reflection 3 years earlier. I've been photographing documents with my phone when I clean the conference room. I know it's not legal, but I also know that what they're doing is destroying people's lives. My grandmother isn't the only one. I've heard them joke about managing elderly clients who ask too many questions about their diminished account balances. That evening, Maria found herself in the familiar position of someone who'd tried to move beyond a formative experience, only to discover that the experience had shaped her into someone who couldn't ignore similar injustice when it appeared in new forms. She called Daniel Hughes, who had become not just Richard Hale's counsel, but Maria's trusted advisor on matters requiring legal expertise and moral clarity. "Daniel," she said without preamble when he answered his phone, "I have another Catherine Hale situation, but this time it's securities fraud instead of marital betrayal." Daniel's sigh carried the weight of someone who understood that people like Maria and Carmen attracted these situations because they were willing to see what others preferred to ignore. "Tell me everything," he said, and Maria could hear him opening his laptop, preparing to document another case where service workers had become the guardians of justice for people with more money but less moral courage. The investigation that followed took 8 months and involved federal regulators, private investigators, and a class action lawsuit that eventually recovered $43 million for defrauded clients. Carmen Rodriguez became the key witness whose courage and documentation made prosecution possible, protected by whistleblower statutes and supported by a legal team that Daniel Hughes assembled pro bono. Pacific Capital Management's partners were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5 to 12 years, and Carmen's grandmother not only recovered her lost savings, but received additional compensation for the emotional distress of believing she would spend her final years in poverty due to her own financial naivety. The media coverage of the Pacific Capital case inevitably mentioned Maria's role in supporting Carmen, drawing connections to the Catherine Hale investigation that had first brought Maria to public attention. But rather than seeking celebrity, Maria used the platform to advocate for systematic changes, better protection for service workers who witnessed corporate crime, more resources for elderly people navigating complex financial systems, stricter oversight of investment firms that targeted vulnerable populations. Carmen graduated with her business degree and joined Maria's consulting firm as a specialist in detecting financial fraud through operational observation, a unique skill set that combined her service work experience with formal business education. Together, they developed training programs for cleaning services, security guards, and administrative assistants, teaching them how to recognize and report corporate misconduct safely and effectively. Richard Hale, watching Maria's evolution from waitress to business owner to corporate reformer, often reflected on the ripple effects of that night when she'd overheard Catherine's conversation at Café Lumière. One woman's refusal to remain silent had not only saved his family, but had established a new model for corporate accountability that relied on the moral courage of working people who saw everything but were expected to say nothing. "You know what I've learned?" Richard said to Maria during one of their regular coffee meetings. "The most dangerous people to a corrupt system aren't other wealthy people or government regulators or investigative journalists. They're service workers with college degrees and ethical standards and the confidence to speak truth to power." Maria laughed, but she understood his point. Her grandmother's generation of cleaning women had been equally observant, equally moral, but they'd lacked the education, legal resources, and social confidence to challenge the power structures they served. Her generation had those advantages, plus the historical perspective to understand that silence in the face of injustice was complicity with oppression. 5 years after Catherine's conviction, Emma Hale graduated from Stanford with a degree in business ethics and a summer internship at Maria's consulting firm. The teenager who had saved her father by refusing to accept her mother's lies had become a young woman committed to preventing similar betrayals from occurring in other families. "I want to understand how people like my mother think," Emma told Maria during her first week of work, "not to excuse what she did, but to develop better systems for detecting deception before it destroys so many lives." Emma's senior thesis, based on her internship research, analyzed the psychological profiles of white-collar criminals who targeted their own families and business partners. Her work identified patterns of behavior that could serve as early warning signs for financial betrayal. Subtle changes in spending habits, increased secrecy about business relationships, the systematic isolation of potential witnesses, the weaponization of legal and financial systems against vulnerable family members. The thesis was published in the Harvard Business Review and became required reading in business ethics courses at universities across the country. Emma's ability to write about family betrayal with scholarly objectivity, while maintaining compassion for both victims and perpetrators, established her as a unique voice in corporate reform discussions. James Hale, now 18 and preparing for college, chose a different path, but one equally influenced by his family's experience with systematic deception. He enrolled in a criminal justice program with plans to work as a federal investigator specializing in financial crimes. His childhood experience of watching his mother destroy innocent people had given him an early understanding of how evil could disguise itself as normalcy, how betrayal could masquerade as love, how the people who caused the most damage were often those who appeared most respectable. "I want to catch people like Mom before they destroy families like ours," James told his father during a conversation about college choices. "Emma wants to prevent betrayal through better systems. I want to investigate it after it happens and make sure the victims get justice." Richard supported both of his children's career choices, understanding that their mother's betrayal had shaped them in opposite but complementary ways. Emma had become someone who wanted to protect trust. James had become someone who wanted to punish the betrayal of trust. Both were necessary roles in a society where people like Catherine could exist and flourish until someone with moral courage chose to stop them. Daniel Hughes, now running one of San Francisco's most respected business ethics law firms, often used the Hale case as an example in lectures to law students and business professionals. His presentation always emphasized the same central point: legal systems could only function effectively when ordinary people had the courage to report wrongdoing and the protected right to speak truth without risking their livelihoods. The Catherine Hale case succeeded not because lawyers and investigators were particularly brilliant, Daniel would tell his audiences, but because a waitress named Maria Santos refused to pretend she hadn't heard what she had heard. Justice depends on citizens who understand that protecting their own safety at the expense of others' welfare isn't actually safety. It's collaboration with systems that will eventually victimize them too. George Martinez, now 82 and still teaching cooking classes in San Rafael, had become something of a local celebrity as the man who'd survived false accusations and emerged with his dignity intact. His story was often told in community centers and church groups as an example of how character could survive temporary disgrace, how truth could triumph over carefully constructed lies, how ordinary people could become heroes simply by refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. "People ask me if I'm angry about what Mrs. Catherine did to me," George would say during his presentations. "The answer is no. Anger is too heavy to carry for so long. But I'm grateful every day for the people who believed in truth more than they feared inconvenience. Maria Santos risked her job and her safety to defend someone she'd never met. That's not anger. That's love in action. On the 4th anniversary of Catherine's conviction, Maria organized a dinner at her cafe for everyone whose lives had been changed by the investigation. Richard brought Emma and James, now confident young adults who had learned to define family by choice and loyalty rather than blood and legal obligation. Daniel came with his wife and twin daughters, who had grown up hearing bedtime stories about the importance of speaking up for people who couldn't protect themselves. George brought his prize-winning tomatoes and a new batch of young immigrants he was teaching to cook traditional Mexican food while they studied English and business skills. Carmen Rodriguez arrived with her grandmother, a dignified elderly woman whose savings had been restored and whose faith in human goodness had been renewed by Carmen's courage and Maria's support. Sofia Santos, now Dr. Sofia Santos, brought her latest research on healthcare disparities affecting immigrant communities, work that had been partially funded by grants from the Richard Hale Foundation for Social Justice. As they shared food and stories around tables that had once witnessed Catherine's conspiracy, Maria reflected on how the most significant moments in life often began with small choices that seemed insignificant at the time. Her decision to document an overheard conversation, Daniel's choice to investigate estate documents more thoroughly, Emma's refusal to accept her mother's accusations against George. None of these actions had felt particularly heroic in the moment, but together they had prevented enormous harm and created lasting change. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Maria said as the evening wound down and her friends prepared to return to their respective lives and responsibilities. "I think about all the times people witness wrongdoing and choose silence, all the small betrayals that never get exposed, all the victims who suffer alone because potential allies decide it's not their problem." Richard, who had spent years contemplating the same questions, nodded thoughtfully. "But I also think about how many people find the courage to act when they see clear examples of what's possible. Your story has been told in business schools, law schools, community colleges, corporate training programs. How many future Catherine Hales have been prevented because someone remembered what you did and decided to speak up instead of staying silent? It was impossible to quantify the ripple effects of moral courage, but Maria understood Richard's point. Every time someone chose ethical action over personal convenience, they created a small precedent that made similar choices easier for the next person facing a comparable dilemma. Evil flourished when good people felt isolated and powerless. It withered when good people realized they were part of a larger community of individuals committed to justice and mutual protection. As Maria cleaned up after the dinner, she found a note that Emma had left behind, a single sheet of paper that would join George's wife's locket and Carmen's grandmother's thank you card in Maria's collection of reminders about why her work mattered. "Dear Maria," the note read, "4 years ago, you saved our family not by doing something extraordinary, but by doing something ordinary with extraordinary courage. You listened when someone needed to be heard. You spoke when someone needed to be defended. You acted when action was required. Thank you for showing me that heroism isn't about grand gestures. It's about refusing to let cruelty prosper when you have the power to stop it. Love, Emma, who learned from you that love is a verb, not just a feeling." 10 years after Catherine's arrest, Maria Santos stood before a congressional committee investigating corporate fraud and the role of service workers in detecting white-collar crime. The hearing room was packed with reporters, advocates, and business leaders who had come to hear her testimony about systematic changes needed to protect whistleblowers and reward moral courage. "Distinguished committee members," Maria began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had learned that her perspective mattered in rooms full of powerful people. "I appear before you today not as someone seeking recognition, but as someone who understands that the current system fails both victims of corporate crime and the working people who are best positioned to detect it." Her testimony drew on a decade of consulting work. Hundreds of cases where service workers had witnessed financial fraud, sexual harassment, safety violations, and other corporate misconduct. She presented data showing that early detection by employees could prevent billions of dollars in economic damage and protect millions of vulnerable consumers from exploitation. The Catherine Hale case was not unique because of the scope of the betrayal, Maria concluded. It was unique because circumstances aligned to give one waitress the resources and support needed to act on what she witnessed. How many similar cases go unreported because working people lack legal protection, financial resources, or confidence that anyone will take their concerns seriously? The legislation that emerged from the hearings, known as the Santos Whistleblower Protection Act, established new safeguards for service workers who reported corporate misconduct, created financial incentives for early reporting of white-collar crime, and required corporations to implement anonymous reporting systems monitored by independent third parties. Catherine Hale, now in her 8th year of federal prison, heard about the legislation through news reports that filtered into the minimum security facility where she served her sentence. Her fellow inmates, many of whom were working-class women convicted of fraud or embezzlement, found dark humor in the fact that a waitress's courage had transformed corporate accountability law. "You got taken down by your own coffee server," observed Janet, a former bank teller serving time for stealing customer deposits to pay her daughter's medical bills. That's gotta sting, knowing that someone you treated like furniture brought down your whole operation. Catherine's response surprised her informal audience. "Maria Santos didn't bring down my operation," she said quietly. "My operation brought down itself. I made the mistake of thinking that intelligence and sophistication could substitute for character, and that working people were too powerless to demand justice. I was wrong about both assumptions." Prison had given Catherine unwanted time to contemplate the choices that had led to her downfall. She understood now that her scheme had failed not because of superior investigation or unexpected cooperation, but because she had fundamentally misunderstood the moral landscape in which she operated. She'd assumed that people with less money had less power, and that people with less power had less courage. Maria Santos had demonstrated the falseness of both assumptions. "The ironic thing," Catherine continued, "is that if I had treated the people around me with basic human respect, George, Maria, even Marcus, none of them would have had reason to oppose me. My cruelty created my enemies. My arrogance created my downfall." Meanwhile, in San Francisco, the cafe where everything had begun displayed a small plaque near the corner booth where Catherine had planned her betrayal. "This space is dedicated to all the working people who refuse to let injustice pass in silence. Your courage matters. Your voice counts. Your conscience is needed." Maria had insisted that the plaque include no names, no reference to her specific story, no details that would turn her cafe into a tourist destination. Instead, it served as a daily reminder to customers and employees that ordinary spaces could become extraordinary places when occupied by people committed to doing right rather than doing well. Richard Hale, now remarried to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a constitutional law professor who shared his commitment to social justice, continued to use his wealth and influence to support whistleblower protection and corporate reform. The Richard Hale Foundation had grown into one of the country's most effective advocates for working people who discovered corporate misconduct, providing legal support, financial assistance, and public advocacy for individuals facing retaliation for speaking truth to power. Emma and James, both working in corporate accountability from different angles, had developed a model law practice that focused on preventing white-collar crime through comprehensive ethical training and early intervention systems. Their approach combined Emma's research on psychological patterns of betrayal with James's investigative experience in financial fraud, creating a unique practice that served both corporations seeking to improve their ethical cultures and individuals concerned about potential misconduct in their workplaces. Daniel Hughes had been appointed to a federal judgeship where his experience with the Hale case influenced his approach to corporate crime sentencing. He was known for imposing substantial penalties on white-collar criminals while showing leniency toward working people who committed crimes under economic pressure, understanding the difference between greed and desperation, between betrayal and survival. George Martinez had passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 85, surrounded by the extended family of former students, immigration mentees, and community members whose lives he had enriched through decades of quiet service. His funeral became an unintentional celebration of how dignity and integrity could inspire loyalty that lasted longer than any marriage contract or employment agreement. Carmen Rodriguez had established her own financial consulting firm specializing in elder fraud prevention and community-based investment education. Her clients were primarily working-class families and recent immigrants who had been deliberately excluded from mainstream financial services, people who needed honest advice and cultural competence more than they needed complex investment strategies. On what would have been George's 90th birthday, Maria organized the final annual dinner for the group that had become known informally as the Catherine Hale Survivors. Everyone was busy now with careers and families and the ordinary challenges of living meaningful lives, but they still felt connected by the experience that had taught them how much they could trust each other when facing seemingly impossible odds. As the evening progressed and friends shared updates about their work, their children, their ongoing commitment to justice in various forms, Maria realized that Catherine's betrayal had ultimately created something more valuable than what it had destroyed. The web of relationships that emerged from their shared experience of choosing courage over comfort had become a model for how communities could protect themselves from sophisticated predators. "I have a confession to make," Richard said as the dinner concluded, and friends prepared to continue their separate journeys. "For years I felt guilty about the chaos that Catherine's betrayal brought into your lives. You were all just trying to live ordinary lives, and suddenly you were thrust into legal investigations and media attention and all the stress that comes with challenging powerful people." "Richard," Maria interrupted gently, "what Catherine did to you was horrible. But what we did together, the investigation, the support, the accountability, that was the best thing that's ever happened to me. It taught me that my voice mattered, that my observations had value, that I could make a difference in outcomes that seemed too big for someone like me to influence." Emma nodded her agreement. "Growing up in Pacific Heights, I was taught that wealth was the most important thing, that money equaled worth, that powerful people deserved their power because they were somehow more valuable than ordinary people. Watching Mom get outmaneuvered by ordinary people taught me that wealth without character is just money, and that the most valuable people are often the ones society values least." As Maria walked home after the last dinner, she thought about the letter she'd received that morning from a hotel housekeeper in Chicago who had overheard executives planning to defraud their pension fund. The woman had read about Maria's story and was asking for advice about whether to report what she'd witnessed, whether someone like her could make a difference against people with teams of lawyers and sophisticated financial resources. Maria's response had been immediate and definite. "Your moral courage is more powerful than their money. Your willingness to protect innocent people is more valuable than their willingness to exploit them. You have more allies than you realize. People like me who understand that justice depends on people like you refusing to let injustice pass unchallenged." The reply she'd sent to Chicago would be followed by a phone call to Daniel Hughes, who would connect the housekeeper with local legal resources and federal investigators. The pattern that had started in a San Francisco cafe would repeat itself in a Chicago corporate boardroom with the same essential elements: working people with sharp eyes and moral courage, professionals with ethical standards and legal expertise, and a system that sometimes, just sometimes, rewarded truth over power. That night, as fog rolled in from the Pacific and wrapped San Francisco in its silver embrace, Maria Santos fell asleep in her apartment overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, wearing George's wife's locket and thinking about her grandmother's words. Truth was like water, finding ways to surface through the smallest cracks. It just needed people willing to serve as its vessels, to let it flow through them toward the light, regardless of the personal cost. In a minimum security prison in Northern California, Catherine Hale read by lamplight, working toward a business degree that she hoped might help her build something ethical instead of perpetrating something cruel when she was finally released. She'd never apologize for her crimes. Her character didn't allow for that kind of remorse. But she'd learned to respect the character of the people who had defeated her. In its own twisted way, that was progress. And throughout the country, in hotels and office buildings, in restaurants and hospitals, working people went about their invisible labor, seeing everything, hearing everything, knowing everything. Most stayed silent, protecting themselves and their families from powerful people who didn't want their secrets exposed. But some, inspired by stories of waitresses and housekeepers and lawyers and teenagers who had chosen courage over comfort, found ways to let the truth surface, to make the invisible visible, to transform service into justice. The wine glass had shattered on a marble floor, blood had pooled beneath crystal shards, and an empire of deception had come crashing down. But from the destruction, something better had emerged, proof that ordinary people with extraordinary courage could hold powerful people accountable, that truth could triumph over money, and that heroes came in many forms, often wearing uniforms that made them invisible to everyone except those who needed them most. And you? Have you ever witnessed betrayal in the midst of trust? Have you ever been the quiet guardian standing between innocence and exploitation? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that heroism comes in many forms, leave a like and subscribe so it reaches another soul who needs to remember that their voice matters, their choices count, their courage can change everything. For more stories that celebrate the dignity of service and the power of unexpected alliances, click the podcast link on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us. See you in our next story.